So I just saw the film Man on the Run, and I just posted another video with my initial impressions. And I think it's definitely a film that requires some thought. It's not just a visual and sonic experience bringing you back into the world of the 1970s and Paul McCartney's place in the musical world of that time. Although I wouldn't say it does a great job contextualizing his music either within the politics of the age or within the musical landscape of the era. The focus is very much on Paul, on his family, on his various efforts to either go solo or work with other artists, create a band, involve his wife in the band. And I think there's a kind of a counterpoint that develops when you watch the film. There's another message that when you think about it, when you think back on it, becomes loud and clear over time. And the message is quite simple, and that is Paul was struggling to find his own voice, which he did, but the presence of John Lennon hovered over him that entire period. And that's also made clear in the film. There are many, many references to John Lennon. There is some visual footage of Lennon, although he doesn't play a big role in the story. The story is about Paul, of course, and Paul and John had really split up at that time. They spent very little time together in the 1970s. I think there was that one moment in the mid 70s when Paul was at the Dakota, where John lived in New York City, and there was that question of whether they were going to go over to join the Saturday Night Live crew, and they didn't. That's explained in the film. So there was a kind of a moment of friendship that peaked out, and we know that Paul and Linda spent some time with John and Yoko, but for the most part, they were going their separate ways. So I think the message that really comes clear to me when watching this film, or at least thinking about it afterwards, is the importance of that partnership as a key to the Beatles. As I've said before, the core engine of the Beatles, of their songwriting. And after the breakup of that partnership, there was kind of a tragic aftermath that neither artist was ever able to achieve by themselves what they had achieved together. Of course, they continued to do great things. They were talented artists in their own right. But it was that kind of magical combination of Paul and John that elevated the Beatles to just a higher plane than anything that came after. And I would add George as well. George and Ringo, obviously, though they were playing a secondary role to Paul and John in the Beatles, they were part of that magic as well. So it was that combination of the four of them. I think it was also a product of their youth. They had come out of their teenage years playing music in rock clubs. They had honed their teeth and honed their skills, cut their teeth maybe, and honed their skills on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, that infamous 10,000 hours that they must have done, at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, playing live. And this has always been a focus of my own research as a historian of nightlife, as a historian of popular music, of live music. And I teach a course on live music scenes to this day. I've always thought that the most important aspect of music is the live performance. Sure, we have these wonderful recordings of great artists, But it was in the live environment that they truly honed their skills, honed their craft. You could even say that the studio became a kind of a substitute for the live music environment, with them experimenting and maybe having a very limited audience. There's some argument there. But my focus has always been on live music. And I think that one of the greatest challenges that the Beatles faced when well before they split up, was that they became so popular and had such a powerful presence in front of their audiences that they felt they could no longer perform live. And so they became recording artists exclusively. And that lasted for the last 3 years of their career as the Beatles, until they gave that final live performance on the rooftop, which was kind of a pseudo live performance. They didn't really have an audience there. Certainly not the kind of audience that you would have in a club scene, let alone a stadium. So they had stopped being a live band. And I think that one of the goals and one of the struggles, one of the challenges that both Paul and John faced was, how do I become a live musician again? How do I redevelop my skills, my craft, and my career as a live musician facing a live audience? That's a big theme in Man on the Run. Because Paul starts out from scratch, basically, with just Linda. You have him at first just recording on his own in his own studio. He is a one-man band, after all. He can play any instrument quite well. So he can create his own compositions, write his own songs. He can record his own music, and it's decent. His first couple of albums were okay. I think Ram was a great album, but it was very lo-fi, right? And I kind of grew up in a lo-fi world. I think that the 1970s, there was that kind of lo-fi vibe, and you get that from the movie. Paul was kind of a hippie. And as a child of kind of hippies, I can relate to that. Growing up in the 1970s, he was, in a way, maintaining a lifestyle and an ethos that was disappearing, right? That many consider had disappeared at the end of the 1960s. And he was maintaining that, living on a farm and recording his own music, right? And then he gets back on stage, haltingly at first, but slowly building up momentum with his new band Wings. And then they eventually become quite big. They have their breakthrough album, Band on the Run. They have a string of hits. And pretty soon they're playing to, stadium-sized crowds again. And Paul is back in the action. John had a different pathway. Obviously, this is not the subject of Man on the Run, but it's alluded to. He had his own trajectory. He did get back on stage now and then, but never, certainly not at the level that Paul did. And maybe there was a little bit of rivalry and jealousy there. And that's what I kind of want to bring this talk back to, right? I'm circling back to the subject of John and Paul and their breakup. And after reading that book by Ian Leslie, which I reviewed a few months ago, John and Paul, it really makes you realize how deep and emotional their relationship was. And you get a sense of that by watching the film Man on the Run. Paul is never really able to truly let go of the presence of John or his absence. Obviously, he's never able to find another creative, collaborative partner as strong, as talented, as gifted as John, and vice versa. John was never able to find another Paul in his life. And let's face it, their wives were no substitutes in terms of creative collaboration for the John and Paul combo. Although it is interesting that both of them, at the end of, just when they were breaking up as a band, they went off with their respective new wives, Linda and Yoko, and really tried to make a career out of collaborating with their wives. It was almost as if they were challenging each other and saying, hey, look what I can do with my new partner, my sexual romantic partner. And so there's this tension that I think you feel throughout the 1970s that really only ends when John is savagely, tragically murdered in 1980, which does mark the end of the film. The tension is, can they create music that's as good as what they did together when they're apart? And the other question that hovers throughout the film that people are constantly asking is, will they get back together? Everybody's wondering, will you get back together? Will the Beatles form again? Will John and Paul ever work together again and collaborate again? And of course, the answer is no. And so there is kind of a tragic unfolding there of a sense of loss, a sense that they would never do alone or separately what they did together, and that nothing that they did as artists from then on would really compare. And I think that has to some extent borne out in subsequent decades. Obviously, we don't know what John would have done with his career. We know what Paul did. He had a long and very successful career as a musician, working with many fine artists, with many great artists. I mean, he worked with Michael Jackson in the 1980s. He worked with Stevie Wonder. He was working with the best of the best. Right, but none of those songs created out of his collaborations with these other artists ever really matched up to what the Beatles did. That's my opinion. I'm sure that I share it with many people. If you have a different opinion, I'd be happy to know. They were good songs. I don't think he did bad work. I think what he did with Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonder in the 1980s was some good stuff, but it was nowhere near the level of what the Beatles had achieved. What he has done in his solo career, I would say the stuff that he's done in his solo career that kind of comes close to the Beatles tends to be the stuff that he was already doing when he was a Beatle. So, for example, his solo acoustic compositions, I think, are among his best work. He continued to be a great solo acoustic artist. I think that's an underrated, well, maybe not underrated, but it's one of his many skills. We all think of him as a superb bass player, right? And that's his greatest musical skill and talent. But he was also a very fine guitarist and a great composer on guitar. Almost, dare I say, to the level of a Bach or a Mozart. And you can certainly see that in Blackbird. And I think that he continued in his own compositions through the 1980s and beyond to compose wonderful solo acoustic pieces. But he always wanted to play with a band. I think that was his great desire, was to kind of rekindle the spirit of playing in a rock and roll band, playing live performances. And he did all that. And he's been doing all that for, the past 50 years, which is amazing. But again, I don't think that any of his post-Beatles work really matches up to or equals up to what he did as a Beatle. So I think that's a kind of almost a hidden, subtler message that we get from watching the film. Yes, he was able to recover his career and continue to develop as a musician, continue to grow, play with other musicians, to learn new skills, to recover his stature as a live performer, and as an entertainer, as a celebrity figure of great stature in the world. But I think there's a reason why he continues to incorporate Beatles songs into his repertoire, into his set list when playing live performance. That's what everybody wants. Everybody wants to hear him sing the old Beatles songs. Sure, there are fans of Wings, and there are fans of his solo stuff, like me. But I think that's more of a personal attribute. For me, it's a consequence of growing up in the 1970s, hearing a lot of his music as a child, and having a lot of personal feelings and associations with that music. Objectively, I'm not going to put it on the level of what he did as a Beatle. So it really comes down to collaboration. It's a message about collaboration, about creative collaboration, and how sometimes in our lives as creative workers, creative artists, we meet people who become our partners, our collaborative partners, who equal us in abilities and skills, although their abilities and skills may be complementary to ours. They're not exactly like us. In fact, it's the contrast that makes the combination so great. And I think of my own creative collaborations with other partners, with people whom I made films together with, people whom I wrote books together with. And I feel that the work that we did was better than the work that I could have done myself. I don't want to speak for the other person, but there is a kind of magic when you form a creative partnership with somebody who in many ways is your equal. Sometimes you're better in certain areas. Maybe you're better than they are in other areas. And that's why it's a collaborative partnership. It's not one person leading another. It's a true partnership, which is what John and Paul always were from the very beginning, a true collaborative partnership. John may have been the ostensible band leader, especially in the early years, but he and Paul were on the same level, bringing the same game, the same amount of responsibility, and the same level of creativity, craftsmanship, artistry to their work. There is a moment in the film where Paul expresses some resentment, perhaps, against John for taking a lot of credit for the Beatles songs and maybe dismissing Paul's own achievements. But that was part of the spirit of their breakup. They were just, especially John, I think they threw barbs and needles at each other. It's fair to say neither John nor Paul perhaps did more to disparage the other. I think they were equal in their attacks, which were often kind of slightly veiled in the songs that they wrote. How Do You Sleep at Night? Too Many People, and so on. So they continued to have a conversation. That was the other interesting thing that's kind of understated in the movie, but it's definitely there. You'd have to know the stories. They're not going to tell. The film Man on the Run does not tell you this song is a barb against John. This is a barb about Paul. It doesn't tell you that, but if you know the stories, if you know the backstories, you know what's going on, and the context in which those songs come up makes it perfectly clear. So there's a continued rivalry, a kind of baiting each other, challenging each other, that goes on throughout the 1970s, which is a very interesting kind of counterpoint to the main theme of Paul's rise as a post-Beatles artist in his own right. But I think it proves the point that what they had together was a kind of magical combination that I think it's even said in the film that only comes once in a millennium. I don't remember if Sean Lennon said that, but there was a phrase. One of the interviewees said, "This is a partnership that only comes once in a millennium," and I think he's right. I don't think we're likely to see something that great again in our lifetimes, although we may be pleasantly surprised. So those are my thoughts for today. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment.